Simon, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm doing great. How are you?
Very well, thank you. My pleasure. And I think the best place to start is probably with the congratulations, because I think you are, not even months, maybe weeks away from announcing your successful kind of seed round raise. What was it, just shy of $4 million, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much. And it seems like old news to us, because there's always a bit of a delay between when it actually happens internally and when you announce it. But really great, and it's been super great to hear from you and others in the field, and we're really excited about it and how that sets us up for the next part of our journey. So really nice to get there.
Awesome. Well, we want to get into that, but maybe a good starting point, just for the audience, to give us a bit of background on yourself, your journey, what got you to becoming the co-founder of Klimateco and what the business is all about. That would be great.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And so my name is Simon. I'm the co-founder of Climate. Originally I come from academia. I studied geography back in my undergrad, then looked a bit in environmental policy for my master's, and then I did a PhD in environmental science where I looked at forestry issues, especially deforestation, and what that does to our sort of planetary health, and especially around climate change, focusing a lot on what companies could do. And having worked a bit in academia, I then got into consulting in an engineering consultancy role, and was working for quite a few years in project development in Latin America and Africa, a lot around renewable energy, bioenergy, forestry, and those sort of like various energy and land related projects that are done to mitigate climate change. And a lot of those touch on carbon markets, and not so much now as they did 10 years ago when I was beginning my work in that. And that sort of led to the insight that we can leverage climate finance to address climate change, but a lot of the projects that got financing weren't necessarily in need of climate finance, and weren't actually carbon credits wasn't the right tool to address those. And I think renewable energy now, especially being a case in point, right, it is the cheapest option anyway, and you don't need climate finance to address and set up those solutions. And at the same time, we had a lot of those projects where, from a mitigation perspective, and especially from sort of like addressing the storage of carbon, there were some projects and technologies that were very nascent and weren't really being scaled. And that was sort of my thinking. And then Katja reached out, who's the founder and CEO of Climate, and she had this idea about scaling carbon removal technologies and what could we do. And she comes from a business background and just saw this from a sort of a market perspective and needed someone who had a bit more of the technical experience. And then she reached out, and we sat around a desk together with our last co-founder, Messemil, and then that led eventually to what is now Climate. So that was about 3.5 years ago, and here we are as a company and having raised us. So that's how I sort of got into this field.
Awesome. Just a quick correction as well. I pronounced the name wrong, but Climate with a K. So yeah, just an apology there, but I will not mispronounce again. Something I'm seeing, obviously, we're in different areas, but we overlap a lot, and that's how we got to know each other. Something I think from a buyer point of view, this market can almost seem crowded right now with how much is going on, how much technology, all these different platforms, which we'll talk about. But maybe in terms of your own platform, what distinguishes what you guys do from other platforms on the market? And I'm using platform in a very broad sense there, because I know it's not just a platform, but what distinguishes you from the other kind of tech players in this space?
I mean, first of all, I think it's really great that it's crowded, actually, because if we look at the amount of carbon we need to remove from the atmosphere, it's absolutely massive, right? It's 10 billion tons plus minus. That's at least the figure that most commonly gets thrown around, and whether it ends up being 5 gigaton or 16 gigaton, as is the upper projection of IPCC, it's a massive amount, right? And it has to scale. This whole area has to scale dramatically the next 20, 30 years. So it's great that there are a lot of people in there. What we have focused particularly on, and sort of also what drove this in the beginning, was that we are a climate tech company. So we're a climate company first and foremost, because this is a climate change problem. But software is a key enabler of growth in many sectors. It can lead to efficiencies, it can lead to greater transparency, it can lead to overall greater effectiveness in the market. And that's essentially what was lacking a bit in the carbon market. And I think some of the things in the carbon market at the moment that we see is also due to lack of, proper accounting and technology option and so forth. So that was really sort of the onset. And what we do is that we see, okay, there are a number of different, you can almost call them assets, even though they really aren't yet classified as financial assets at least, but they are different projects, right? A forestry, reforestation project, a biochar project, and a direct air capture project are different from each other, even though they all move carbon. So we need to look at this as a company that wants to get towards net zero and address sustainability. Look at this as not one, even though they're all accounted for in 1 ton of carbon, it is really different asset classes. So what we've built is essentially, as a company, how do you manage that whole process? How do you manage all your different carbon assets towards your net zero or whatever sustainability target you have? And whether that's something you build up right now as this thing that's called beyond value chain mitigation, essentially supporting climate finance outside your own value chain right now, or whether it's through building up a long-term strategy for net zero, you need to manage those assets. So that's the sort of like the client part of this, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we need to get a lot of money to the technology providers like yourselves and others that are scaling technologies that can remove carbon, right? And by basically grouping different buyers and leveraging the demand of a corporate that needs this towards not only one technology, but a suite of different technologies, we can scale the impact. And essentially, that's what our platform does. It does that in a software setup where it's easy to see what you have, how you manage it, how you manage your contracts, and ultimately, of course, how you then send money to the projects that store carbon.
Do you talked about assets there, you talked about the accounting of those. In terms of how you see the market today and moving forward, do you see businesses that are making these investments in removal having kind of portfolios then across lots of different types of technologies? Do you see that as a pretty kind of fundamental strategy in terms of the investment mechanisms in the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is now more and more sort of coming to be a thing that is considered fairly normal. I mean, when we started Climate, I think we were, if not the first, definitely one of the first to offer a portfolio of options, because we saw, okay, well, you need this approach of direct air capture does one thing well, biochar does another thing well, forestry does a third thing well. And if you combine them, you can sort of mitigate some of the risks and still drive impact, right? And also, of course, prices are something that matters. So I think, yes, a portfolio approach is getting more and more common. Of course, that being said, it's not only about having a portfolio, right? It's also about understanding what is in that portfolio. So I think that is sort of like being pioneered by what Microsoft has been doing, what we and others that are offering these different portfolios are doing. And of course, also with new technologies coming to the market, understanding what those technologies do is a key part of that.
What do you think I mean, you may have answered this a little bit anyway with your kind of value proposition of climate, but what are you seeing as the main challenges for the biomarket? I know how I see it from Biochar Life, and interesting to hear from your side because it's probably quite different. I know what we see as difficult in terms of communicating what our technology is and the value of it, but yeah, in terms of the broader biomarket, what are you seeing as the biggest challenges today?
That is a good question, right? I think it depends a little bit on where you are. I mean, obviously, things like pricing is important, right? Yeah. We're still operating in a market where there's a big avoidance market out there. For all its faults, there are still some great projects in the avoidance market. There's also a lot that are not so great. But a lot of those projects are at a lower price point. And I mean, often, what you pay for is what you get, right? So there's a need to understand from a buyer perspective that, it does cost money to remove carbon. I mean, if it didn't cost anything, we probably wouldn't have a climate change problem of the size we do have, right? So obviously, putting money towards it is a key part of this. And potentially that also has to do with something around like, how are they offsetting, or how are they investing in compensation, or whatever you call it. And if that becomes a ton for ton approach that you always want to invest in a similar amount of tonnage as what you're emitting, right, you will end up in almost any business with a very low priced carbon credit, right? And that is one part of it. Then, of course, the second part is that we need to have projects out there that can actually deliver. Biochar is great because as one of the few removals, it's actually not only made sales, it's also actually delivered on those sales and actually had carbon being stored. So that is really why I think biochar, for example, is a key technology in the next couple of years. But companies still need to understand this, right? We're still at the very early days of the sort of carbon market 2.0 or the carbon removal market. Companies have not really understood, in the broad sense at least. I mean, I know there are really, the people out there that really do a great job and lead this sector forward, but most sort of bread and butter companies still don't do it. And those that might do it don't understand the difference between avoidance and removal. They just see a carbon credit as a carbon credit. So educating those buyers, helping them understand, which is like back to sort of some of our value proposition around the projects are different. A ton isn't necessarily a ton, and having data on what does biochar do, what does forestry do, what does DAC do, is so key to helping buyers make a purchase decision, because you only make a purchase decision if you are confident that what you buy will be right for your company.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think just to your point there, I mean, it's something we see is this, a lot of what we're doing is educating, right? But certainly this kind of understanding two things: what are removals, versus avoidance, which sounds like a simple question, but I think more broadly, what are they in terms of cost? Because, there are, major differences in the cost. And it seems to me that there is still some way to go in terms of buyers recognizing that additional value in that cost and what it means. So yeah, hopefully we're getting there. And certainly with biochar as well, it's interesting for me, or for us, to see the impact of biochar, because it is on the report as delivering something versus a lot of these other technologies that are ultimately futures, right? So I wanted to just clarify a word, actually. The word assets, I mean, when you talk about assets, probably should have done this before, but talk to us what an asset is when you're, not in the general sense, but in the sense of an asset in our market, because it's interesting language that you don't hear everyone use, and I hear you use it a lot. People think of assets and liabilities. But yeah, certainly when you're selling something like this, the word asset is a much handier terminology to use. Talk to us, just for the audience, in terms of what you mean when you talk about a carbon asset.
Yeah, and I think it's, of course, if any bankers and financials are on this line, right, let's clarify that it's not the same as it means in the general financial sector, sure. Right? I do think, however, one of the key differences, and the reason we use this word, one of the key differences between typical avoidance projects and typical removal projects is that for some avoidance projects, you're essentially creating this credit off of a hypothetical baseline, and then essentially the credits are issued right away. I don't want to say pulled out of thin air, but it is sometimes a little bit like that, right? You set a baseline and say, whoopty, we just created 3 million credits. In many removal projects, and especially in the sort of more technological, or at least some kind of hybrid projects where biochar would fall into this category, having one foot in the biomass sector and one foot in the sort of technological sector. In many of those cases, there is actually a physical asset behind the credit being issued. So when you want to issue a credit in biochar, and you build a pyrolysis plant, especially those, with the high temperature, more industrial facilities, to do that, you need a tangible asset. To invest in that, you need a tangible asset. And that facility actually represents a physical asset. So as an investor into this, and I think that's one of the things, it's not fully fledged in the market, but that's one of the things we see could catalyze finance for this, is that as an investor, you can back your investment into biochar with that facility producing things. It's actually producing there's actually a physical asset behind this carbon credit being issued, right? You can measure the carbon being taken out, whether that is DAC or whether that's biochar. You can actually count the physical evidence of what that credit is issued on the basis of. And that is a difference between many of the avoidance projects where you issue this carbon credit based off of some arbitrary baseline that can be more or less correct, but there isn't a physical asset saying, this is how our carbon credit was created. You could argue that in the case of some avoided deforestation projects, the physical forest is the asset, and I would agree that that is a very important asset to protect, right? But in some of these other projects, we don't have that. And framing it as an asset that something is sitting behind it as can be backed could catalyze finance to this, because investors will see, okay, we're not just investing into an arbitrary credit, we're actually investing into an asset that delivers this credit. So that's how we're trying to phrase this, and also understanding that a credit isn't a credit, right? It comes from very different fields, so we have to treat it as different asset classes. Sorry, that got a little long, but
No, that's honestly, it's bang on. So I was really hoping that is what you were going to say, because I probably should have asked it up front. It's really, really important, and I think we all need to be using language like that more for people to understand the value in the removal space and what it's all about. So no, not too long at all. Yeah, in terms of, looking at the broader market internationally, I mean, you guys are obviously, you're in Europe. I'm down here in Southeast Asia. Most of our work is in really, sub-Saharan Africa, in East Africa, actually. But, I know this is a broad question with removals, but where do you see the kind of key areas of the removals market? I suppose it depends on the technologies, but, in terms of international expansion, in terms of putting your head forward 5 to 10 years, where do you see the most impact coming from? And that can be either from an investment or from a impact production point of view. Where do you see the major strides being made?
I mean, I think, of course, again, like if I had a crystal ball, I might
Sure.
be doing something right. But I mean, I think it's really key to understand, first of all, and I think that's something that some companies struggle with because they do this from a marketing perspective in terms of like why they actually buy carbon credits, is that, CO2 is a uniformly mixed greenhouse gas. It doesn't matter where we remove it, which is actually in a sense really nice, because it means we can have these removal technologies in a lot of different places. And obviously each country, each region is endowed with different sort of resources and starting points for scaling this. But if we look at these things, there are actually a lot of places where we can do a lot of these technologies, right? If you take biochar, I think is a key one, right? There are massive amounts of biomass waste all across the world. Obviously, the problem or opportunity, depending on how you phrase it, is bigger in certain regions than others. In some places, in many places still in the parts of the world with sort of less developed economies, we still have a significant amount of biomass being burned in open fields. And that is not only bad for the economy, it's also leading to a lot of health issues. So of course, that's where biochar can sort of come in handy, right? But even sort of not considering that, I think it's the wonderful example I always use is that, geologically speaking, Iceland and Kenya are actually similar, right? No one really thinks of that. They are perceived as two very different countries, but geologically speaking, they have more or less the same. They sit on a rift in the continental plates, so they have geothermal energy, and they have a basaltic underground where you can store the carbon. So that gives two very different countries opportunities to play a very big role, especially for DAC, because that is a technology that requires that, right? But then you also have regions like, the northern part of Europe, where you have a lot of areas for storing carbon in more liquid forms. And you can combine that with a lot of energy production that happens, for example, in the North Sea. There are also places like Vietnam that have pretty good resources for wind. The American West Coast also have a lot. So that, South America has a lot of wind. So there are a lot of places where you can combine and think this in a more like integrated manner. And I think that's really the key thing, is to see this as a system where it's not like this technology will be the cure-all, right? I don't think it's going to be just DAC or just biochar. We're going to need a plethora of solutions. And because we're going to need a lot of different solutions, and if we can make a lot of different solutions available, well, then we can also, in almost every part of the world, we can have a solution that will be really good in that area. Take Namibia, vast amounts of biomass resources available, great potential for biochar. Just as a country like that, I think no one would think of as a country that has a lot of potential in the carbon removal market, right? That actually has a lot of potential. I mean, I think everyone knows that the US has a lot of projects coming on, and that's sort of self-evident. It's such a big country that obviously it has a lot of different opportunities. But even tiny countries can have, a potential for a given technology, and that has to be sort of utilized. And because of this portfolio you asked about earlier, right? Because if we take a approach, we can also spread these technologies more widely and have them benefit more societies globally.
Yeah, I mean, Namibia, I spoke to someone not that long ago in Namibia, and it was just the kind of numbers were staggering in terms of invasive weeds and things that can just be cleared and turned into biochar. I mean, in terms of DAC, I mean, we've seen some massive investments happening, and I think there's differing views on that. I mean, in your in your kind of opinion or in your knowledge, where do you see the real benefits, or how long the real benefits are going to be reaped from the kind of direct air capture investments?
Ooh, that's
I know you're not. I know you're not on the tech side. So sorry if I put you on the.
I mean, I think it's fine, and I mean, obviously, DAC is still a nascent technology, right? I mean, the total amount of carbon being pulled out of the atmosphere from DAC is still tiny. I see it a little bit as where maybe wind was 30, 40 years ago, right? It's something that has potential, but we have seen, like, just the tip of what it could be. Does it have massive challenges to overcome? Absolutely. Have we seen the right solution in DAC yet? Probably not. It's probably going to be a different sorbent. It might be a different way of getting the airflow through the system. There's going to be a lot of engineering required, a lot of R&D before we get to this, right? But I think it's quite self-evident that we will need a lot of different technologies, and having the opportunity to suck CO2 directly out of the atmosphere is a great solution, right? It also is a little bit of a sort of almost a last resort, right? It's probably going to be one of the most expensive ways to do it. So other things like mimicking nature, we haven't really talked about enhanced rock weathering, but things like mimicking natural processes or biochar, where you let photosynthesis do the sort of the capturing of CO2, and then you just make sure it doesn't go back in the atmosphere through decomposition, right? Those technologies will have to play a key role because they can be much more rapidly scaled, and can deliver a lot of the removals in the near term. Will DAC deliver most of the removals in 2100? Maybe. It's quite likely, right? But there's a long way until 2100, and we have to, that's why I said this thing with, investing in a plethora of solutions, because I don't think we should put all our eggs in the DAC basket. It's too uncertain. It might turn out great. It might turn out that simply from a thermodynamical perspective, we can't get it to be really great. And if that is the case, well, then that technology will be limited to very few places where we have vast amounts of excess energy, like Iceland, and can then run that facility there. And if that is the case, well, then DAC will, of course, also be a relatively minor solution because it'll be limited to those very few places. On the other hand, if we can solve some of those challenges around energy consumption, well, then it might scale to much more places where there's, energy system, and it can be part of a broader energy system where when we have excess capacity in the grid, we can run things like DAC plants and power to X and all of those other solutions that are part of mitigating climate change.
Cool. I think thanks for answering that as well. But I think my reframing of that probably should have been, and this is the biochar chip on my shoulder maybe, but the willingness to put money into DAC, particularly in the last 12 months for us, is something of it's encouraging to see for the sector, but maybe discouraging for, hey, we're like, put it into biochar, we'll get credit straight away. But I answer my own question. I think really there's a real R&D kind of pathway here, right, that has to take place from major investors that can support that process to get to a point where it really has value to add. I'm assuming is how you probably see it, right?
Yeah, I think I can understand that sentiment. And absolutely, I think also biochar from a sort of cost effectiveness to permanence aspect, it is probably, one of the best solutions out there. If we can get the MRV component of enhanced rock weathering right, it might also be one of those solutions where, we can probably store a lot of carbon. And there's a bunch of other things we haven't even discussed in the broader market. Yeah. Things, like ocean-based solutions, where, that might also turn out to be really great, but we don't know. We're really early in those type of systems, right? There is a lot of these like different technological pathways that we know very little about. Biochar is probably one of the ones where we know pyrolysis really well. It's actually a pretty old technology. We're just fine-tuning it. And we can use that to then store the carbon, right? But also we have to, I think, acknowledge from a biochar perspective that biomass could end up being a limited resource, right? If we want to make bioplastics, if we want to make e-fuels and stuff like that, right? Biomass will also be needed. So I think, again, like, we can't just put all our eggs in that basket and say biochar will solve it. Sure, we should scale biochar. And there's a ton of waste biomass. We should just make sure to turn into biochar as fast as possible. But again, it's not going to be the only solution, right? So I think that's sort of like the argument for why do we need to put money into things like DAC or some of those other very nascent technologies. It is because we might actually scale them, and that can be another pathway for storing carbon.
Indeed. Probably a good segue to a close. I didn't really have any more questions, and thanks for flying the biochar flag as we chat. But maybe just a kind of closing. Talking about the future for you guys, what's next? And when I say next, the next few years, you mentioned there, the things we haven't talked about. And, I assume within your role, you have to get your head around a huge amount of different types of technologies and opportunities. Where do you see yourselves going? The things that will be your challenges over the next few years in terms of, taking all these things to market?
I mean, I think it depends a little bit on whether you look at the sort of the, what you could say, the buyer's side, like the companies working on this, or whether you look at the technologies. I think if we start with the technologies, MRV is something we have to get better at across the board. And I think that's also partly why we see the projects that are sort of somewhat scandalous in the avoidance sector. It's because of the standards behind those, and some of those things haven't been done rigorously enough. And we have to do this better in the removals market. So digital solutions for MRV, which is normally referred to as, so MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification, just for those not familiar with the acronym. We have to get better at all of those aspects around how do we monitor and verify a project. And we can probably do a lot of that in a digital sense, right? And it's here there's a key difference, at least in my opinion, between what you could call a closed system and an open system. So a closed system is something like a DAC, where you have a facility, you have pipes and things, and you can use probably various kinds of IoT connected devices and other sort of meters to monitor what goes through. The problem with a closed solution is that every time you expand it, you have to build more infrastructure. And then you have open systems, which is something like partly biochar, but especially enhanced rock weathering and a lot of other nature-based solutions, where that component is so important, because if we don't get that right, we erode the trust in that solution if it turns out to be less effective, less permanent, etc., than we believed, right? So a lot of research has to go into improving that, both on the sort of academic side, but also on the project developer side. How do they ensure that their projects are actually, doing what they say they're doing? But also in our case, right, we have a lot of data. We work with companies like yours, and we want to ensure we work with the right projects. So we are improving our solution for getting a better understanding of each project, helping benchmark projects, collecting more data. So all of that is, I think, one of the key problems in the project development, or sort of like the technology side. And then if we look at the buyer side, well, obviously there are things around legislation and regulatory developments that need to happen. The carbon market in the voluntary sense, where most removals sit today, is still a fraction of the compliance market, which is still, again, a fraction of global emissions, right? That has to change. So much more money has to come into this. And whether that's through expanding the voluntary carbon market, or expanding the compliance market, or some combination thereof, I don't really know. I'm not a policy expert in all of those senses, but something has to change, right? Something has to sense that we can get more money, get more companies investing in this, because that is one of the key solutions to getting 10 gigatons out of the atmosphere. Is we can't just rely on governments to regulate, right? We have to get the private sector to go in on this. That's why it's so great that the likes of the companies behind Frontier, some of the bigger companies that are making huge investments into the voluntary carbon market, and whether that's tech or pharma or banking or whoever is doing this, right? That needs to happen, and it needs to happen much more. We've still seen maybe 2% at best of companies doing this, and we need to see at least 50% and hopefully 100% of companies doing that, because that's the only way we have a shot at staying below the 2 degree or even 1.5 degree, which now looks a bit challenging, to say the least.
Yeah, cool. I couldn't agree more. I mean, just touching on your first point there of MRV, I mean, I certainly, for us, being what you would have described there as an open solution, I mean, for me, that I think is our, aside of price. Obviously price is always going to be a pressure, but getting the MRV piece right when you're tracking people, processes in remote areas, I mean, I think there's going to be some challenges, but also some awesome innovation that we'll see within those areas to kind of close that gap between the buyer and the producer. So
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I didn't have any more questions, but look, I really appreciate you jumping on. If you want to share your details, if people want to find out more about Climate, about yourself, where should they go? Just share them here, and I'll also share them in the notes.
No, absolutely. And thanks so much, Matt, for having me. Absolute pleasure. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I think that's one of the easiest way to find me and get in touch with me. And of course, on Klimate's website, climate.co, you can read more about what we do. It's Climate, like you spell climate, but with a K. Hence the Klimate expression sometimes that gets thrown around. But climate.co, and my email is simon@climate.co. And you're also, of course, welcome to send me an email if you have any more questions or thoughts around this.
Cool. Look, thanks a lot. For anyone watching or listening, I will put all of that in the notes for the podcast. And yeah, thanks again. And I shall leave you to your day. And let's do this again sometime as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and same to you. And we'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Cheers.
Cheers.